Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're taking a deep dive into something that I think a lot of people have, I don't know, maybe some strong feelings about. We're going to be looking at payment surcharges in Australia.
Oh, yeah.
So if you've ever gotten to the checkout and felt a little bit like, wait a minute, why am I paying extra for this? This is the deep dive for you.
Definitely a hot topic.
And the reason that we're looking at this now is because there's been a lot of news lately about the Reserve Bank of Australia, the RBA, and their review of retail payments regulation.
Yeah.
And I think for a lot of people, myself included, when you start reading about this stuff, it gets a little bit confusing. So we're going to try to break this down.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it is a pretty tangled web. Like a lot of people, I find myself kind of scratching my head when it comes to surcharging.
Yeah.
But the good news is everyone pretty much agrees that Australia's system is a bit of a mess. Like, there's a lot of common ground there. But figuring out what to do about it, that's the tricky part. So to really understand this, we've got to start with the RBA. They're kind of like the main character in this whole saga.
Right.
You know, the RBA, they control the money supply, set interest rates, that kind of thing. But what's interesting is that they were actually the first ones to regulate those credit card fees way back in the day.
Oh.
And guess what? They're also the ones who introduced surcharging in the first place.
It's like they created the monster.
Kinda, yeah. And what's even crazier is that Australia is the only country in the world that allows businesses to add a surcharge on top of your payment.
Seriously. The only one.
The only one. And this is despite many other countries adopting that same RBA fee regulation model.
Wild.
And to add another layer to this whole thing, the current RBA governor, Michelle Bullock, she was actually really deep in payment policy back when surcharging first came about.
So she's seen this whole thing play out from the start. But, okay, we've got the RBA kind of setting the stage here, but what are other folks saying about this whole surcharging situation?
Well, there are some pretty strong opinions on both sides, right? Like, on one hand, you have folks who absolutely hate surcharging. Like, there was this submission to the RBA, they didn't want to be named, but they called the whole situation a mess. They basically said it's hurting consumers, could even be contributing to inflation, that sort of thing.
Right.
They're worried that consumers are basically left in the dark about surcharges until the very last minute.
Yeah.
So they're saying it's hard to compare costs, hard to choose different payment methods. It's just a whole mess.
Yeah, I've definitely been there where you're at the checkout, you're about to pay, and then bam, hit with an extra fee, and you're like, what? I didn't know about that.
Right, exactly. But then on the other side of the coin, you have groups like the Independent Payments Forum, the IPF. They're all about protecting small businesses. And they see surcharging as vital for doing just that. They're basically saying it prevents these smaller businesses from having to subsidize the payment costs for those big retailers.
So it's like a David and Goliath situation.
That's their argument, yeah. And they've even gone so far as to propose, like a pretty drastic reduction in the fees for debit, credit, even mobile transactions.
Oh.
They claim these fees are costing Australians a whopping $6.4 billion every single year.
That's a huge number. But hold on, thinking about the IPF itself, isn't there a bit of irony in their position?
Oh, you picked up on that. Yeah, here's where things get kind of interesting. So the IPF, while they're advocating for the little guy, the mom and pop shops, they're largely made up of large merchant associations.
Oh.
It's a little bit of a contradiction there, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, so we've got this situation where some folks say just ditch surcharging altogether.
Yeah.
Others say, no, we needed to protect small businesses. So how do we even start untangling this whole mess?
Well, to really see the big picture, I think we have to bring in someone with expertise in both payments and just business in general. There's this guy, Shkwikanth Yalamanchili. He's a director at PwC Australia, and he has some interesting thoughts on this.
Okay.
His main point is that this whole debate about focusing only on the cost of processing a payment, it's too narrow.
Oh,
You got to think about all those associated costs.
oh, like what?
Things like administration, security, the whole shebang.
Okay.
It's not just about swiping a card. And here's something I bet you didn't know. Australia actually has some of the lowest payment acceptance costs in the world.
Really?
Yeah.
I wouldn't have guessed that.
But here's the catch. What Yalamanchili calls broader payment costs, those are actually growing really fast.
What are broader payment costs, though?
It's expenses tied to things like onboarding new customers, dealing with fraud, disputes, all those settlements. It's all the behind-the-scenes stuff.
Oh, interesting.
And he actually predicts that these broader costs are going to overtake the direct payment costs soon. So what does that mean? Well, it means that small businesses are becoming more willing to pay a little bit more for secure, integrated payment solutions.
So even if it costs a little more upfront.
Exactly. They're prioritizing things like protection from scams and fraud, peace of mind, basically.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you think, though, consumers are willing to pay more for that peace of mind?
It's a great question, and I think it gets to the heart of the issue here.
Yeah,
Consumers want low prices. Businesses want to cover their costs.
right.
And it's about finding that balance. But going back to Yalman, he really hammered on this point that all this confusion around surcharging, it has to be addressed.
Yeah.
He even suggests we look at what other countries have done. How have they tackled this issue? But I think his most compelling point is that for small businesses, they have much bigger things to worry about than just payment costs.
Oh, really? Like what?
He's talking about things like rent, wages, managing cash flow.
Oh, the big stuff.
Yeah, the real pain points. Payments matter, but it's all about perspective.
Yeah, I see what you mean. So it's not as simple as surcharges are good or surcharges are bad.
Right.
It's way more nuanced than that.
Exactly. And you know what? To really see how this plays out in the real world, I think we should take a look at what some of the big players in the payments world are doing.
Okay, yeah. Like who?
So let's talk about Square.
Square, yeah, I've heard of them.
They're a global payment system provider. They're actually owned by Block. And they've made a real name for themselves, especially among those smaller merchants.
Yeah.
And their philosophy is pretty simple. Let the merchants decide if they want a surcharge or not.
So give the power to the businesses.
Exactly. And they make a pretty compelling case for this approach. I mean, Michael Sadat, he's the international head of public policy over at Block. He argues that banning debit surcharging would actually stifle competition and innovation in the Australian payment sector. He sees that merchant acquiring market as like this shining example of competition within financial services. And he says, look, regulation shouldn't stifle that.
So Square is all about choice and flexibility.
Pretty much, yeah. But they also have some interesting thoughts on the broader issue of surcharging. Sada acknowledges that, yeah, banning all surcharges might be the ideal long-term solution.
Okay.
But he says any move like that has to be done carefully so it doesn't hurt small businesses.
It's like a balancing act.
Right. And he even suggests a potential way forward, like a middle ground. He thinks consumers should always have at least one surcharge-free payment option, and it doesn't have to be just cash.
Oh, what else?
He brings up the new payments platform. It's a system that's gaining a lot of traction here in Australia, lets people make low-cost, real-time payments.
Interesting. So give consumers a choice while recognizing that businesses might need to recoup some costs.
Exactly. But what about the RBA, right? They're the ones doing this review. What happens next?
Yeah, what's next?
Well, the deadline for submissions to the RBA has passed, but we probably won't see those made public until sometime next year.
Oh.
And even then, some folks might ask to keep their feedback confidential. It's a long process.
So we're kind of in a holding pattern for now.
Okay.
But it seems like everyone agrees that something needs to change.
Absolutely. Consumers, businesses, even those payment providers, everyone seems to be on the same page about that.
Well, that's a good starting point, right?
It is, yeah. And speaking of change and new developments, there's this other trend happening right now in Australian payments. Buy now, pay later services, or BNPL.
Oh, yeah, BNPL. It's gotten super popular.
Yeah, and it's also caused a lot of debate. But there's been a pretty big shift in how it's viewed legally. BNPL is officially recognized as a form of credit now.
Oh, wow. Well, that makes sense, I guess, right?
Yeah, you are borrowing money to make those purchases, so.
So that's a big change for the industry.
It is. And it's had some ripple effects, like Fintech Australia, it's a group that represents a lot of different folks in financial technology. They've actually taken a neutral stance on the new regulations. They're acknowledging the changes, but they point out that a lot of BNPL providers had already adopted some pretty high standards even before these new laws came in.
So it seems like the industry is adapting. But how big is BNPL anyway?
It's still a relatively small piece of the pie. We're talking less than 2% of all transactions in Australia.
Huh. Okay. Smaller than I thought.
But here's an interesting stat for you. BNPL is way overrepresented among consumers who are having financial difficulties.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's convenient for some people?
Yeah.
But it might actually make things worse for others.
Definitely. And it all brings us back to this bigger conversation, right? Payments, costs, finding solutions that work for everyone.
That's a big challenge.
It is.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about the ins and outs of surcharging in Australia, the RBA's role in all this, those differing views out there, even the rise of BNPL. I feel like I'm starting to see the full picture a little more clearly now. What are your big takeaways from all this?
Yeah, it's a complex issue, that's for sure. No easy answers. But I think we've done a good job highlighting the main challenges here, the different perspectives, some potential paths forward.
Yeah. We've got the RBA's history with this, those arguments for and against surcharging, the broader context of all those payment costs, even the emergence of new technologies like BNPL. It's a
Yeah,
lot to
you're
process.
It is, and I think that's maybe the biggest takeaway, to encourage critical thinking and continued engagement with this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Don't just settle for the status quo. Ask questions, do your own research, and advocate for the changes you want to see. But, before we wrap up, there was this one thing that really stuck with me from all the research. It was something that anonymous consultancy submissions said. They mentioned that surcharging regulation in Australia was flouted from day one.
Yeah, that's a pretty strong statement.
It is.
Mm.
And it makes me wonder, why haven't these issues been addressed more effectively over the past, 2 decades? Australia has had multiple reviews, inquiries into payments and surcharging, and yet the problems persist.
It really does make you think, huh, like we're stuck in this loop of review, debate, and then nothing. What do you think is at the root of all this inaction?
Yeah, what's the holdup?
Well, I think it's a few things, honestly. For one, this whole payments ecosystem is so complex. You've got so many different players, and often their interests clash. Consumers want convenience, affordability. Businesses, they want to keep their costs down, maximize profits. Payment providers, they want to innovate, stay competitive. It's really hard to find a solution that makes everyone happy.
Yeah, it's like a constantly moving target. You can't please everyone all the time.
Exactly. And then you have the whole issue of political will. I mean, any major changes to the system are going to create winners and losers,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Some businesses might benefit from certain regulations while others are put at a disadvantage. So I think politicians are sometimes a little hesitant to make those tough decisions. They don't want to upset powerful groups or disrupt a system that, for all its flaws, is still functioning.
It's that whole don't fix what ain't broke
Yeah.
mentality. But sometimes things are a little bit broken, and we do need to fix them.
Right. But with all this attention on the RBA review, I do think things might be different this time around. There's a growing awareness that this current system isn't sustainable long term.
Fingers crossed. Because Australia really needs a payment system that's, more transparent, more fair, and ultimately more efficient for everyone, not just a select few.
Couldn't agree more. And this brings us to maybe the most important question. What does a better payment system actually look like for Australia? If you were starting from scratch, what would be your top priorities when designing a new system?
Okay, that's a great question. If you had to pick just 3 core principles, what would they be?
Transparency, fairness, and innovation. Those would be my big three.
I like it. Let's break those down a bit. Starting with transparency, what would that actually look like in a real-world payment system?
Transparency means consumers know exactly what they're paying for upfront. No surprises at the checkout. So they need clear, easy to understand information about the costs associated with different payment methods. Whether it's a surcharge, a transaction fee, some other hidden cost, it should all be laid out clearly. That way consumers are empowered to make informed choices and really shop around.
No more hidden fees. I like it.
Yeah.
What about fairness? How do we make sure a system is fair for everyone, not just the big players?
That's all about balance. It means businesses can cover their costs without resorting to these crazy surcharges, while consumers are protected from price gouging and have access to affordable payment options. It's about finding that sweet spot where everybody wins.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, lastly, we have innovation. Why is that so important for a payment system?
Well, think about it. Technology is constantly changing. The way we pay for things has evolved so much, even in the past decade. We have contactless payments, mobile wallets, even cryptocurrencies on the horizon. So a payment system that embraces innovation can adapt to those changes.
So it's about keeping up with the times.
Right. And not just keeping up, but leading the way. Creating an environment where new ideas can flourish, leading to even more choices, better deals for everyone. But of course, those innovations have to be secure, reliable, and easy for everyone to use. We don't want to leave anyone behind.
So to recap, a better system for Australia would be transparent, fair, and innovative. One that benefits everyone, not just a select few.
Well said. And getting there requires collaboration and compromise from everyone involved. The government, regulators, businesses, consumers, tech companies, we all need to work together.
It's a team effort for sure.
Exactly. And this conversation, this is just the beginning.
So for our listener who's been trying to wrap their head around this whole surcharging situation, what would be your final piece of advice.
Stay curious, stay informed, stay engaged. The world of payments is always evolving, and having that knowledge can help you save money, make smarter choices,
All about learning.
right?
Wow, I feel like we've really gotten into the weeds of Australia's surcharging situation with this deep dive.
It's definitely complex, but I think we did a good job of unpacking the main issues.
Yeah, from the RBA's role in all of this to those different perspectives on surcharging itself.
And don't forget the whole picture of payment costs and those new technologies like BNPL coming onto the scene.
It's a lot to take in, but I hope our listeners are feeling a bit more informed.
Me too. The key is to keep the conversation going,
Absolutely. Don't just accept the status quo, right? Do your research, ask questions, and push for the changes you want to see.
Couldn't agree more.
But before we wrap up completely, I want to leave our listeners with something to really chew on.
Oh, I like that.
A question to spark some more thinking.
All right, hit me with it.
Okay, here it is. If you were the one designing a brand new payment system for Australia, one that's fair for everyone, businesses and consumers alike, what would be your top priorities?
That's a good one.
What would it look like? What problems would you solve?
Yeah. Wow, that's a real challenge. It really gets you thinking about the future of payments in Australia.
Yeah, and who knows, maybe our listener will be the one to come up with the next big idea that changes how we all pay for things.
Hey, you never know.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive into the world of surcharging in Australia.
It's been a pleasure.
But this is just the beginning of the conversation.
Keep learning, keep questioning, and most importantly, keep exploring.
Great advice. Until next time, happy paying, everyone.